All right. Hello, guys. Welcome back. This is going to be the last lecture I have for you that will be on the final. There's going to be one more posted, but that won't be stuff covered on the final. So with that said, let's just get right into it. What do you have left to do in this entire class? You have two reading quizzes, 14 and 17. They're due Sunday. After this lecture, you should have everything you need to complete those. We have our final exam, which is August 20th next week on Wednesday from 3:30 to 5:30. This is going to cover everything post midterm, so it's non-cumulative. I will say this will not be on Zoom. I put out a Canvas announcement about this. Pretty much how it's going to work is you're just going to log into Canvas, open up the assignment of the final exam at 3:30, and then it will be the similar process to the midterm where it's a PDF. You'll fill out your answers and then you'll submit via PDF, but it's not going to be on Zoom. Okay. And then the last thing you guys have to worry about is you have one more article response, which is due August 22nd, which is the Friday after the final. If you want to get those in early, that's would be highly recommended because then you're done with the class 2 days earlier on Wednesday. So it's not a bad deal. Okay, so what are we talking? We're talking about the Fed today. We're gonna do a bunch of see how the Fed works with money. This is kind of like our monetary policy little piece that we're gonna do. If you want to learn more about any of the stuff that we get into, we kind of just get into a bunch of surface level stuff here. I would highly suggest taking Econ 301, which is intermediate macro. For those that are interested, also economics, great major. You should apply and join the major because the introduction classes can be a little boring from time to time because we can't really get into a whole lot. When you get into the upper level classes, you really dive into a lot of the nitty-gritty for all these subjects, which I think makes it more interesting. Specifically, like monetary policy, I'm pretty sure there's a upper level elective that's geared right towards monetary policy. A little background though on the Fed. The Federal Reserve System, so it was created in 1913 in response to a financial panic in 1907. So before the Federal Reserve System, we did not have a central bank. So there was no lender of last resort, meaning like if the banks got in trouble, your money was kind of screwed in a certain way. JP Morgan took on that role during the crisis, but after that, we realized we need a permanent public institution to do this. It's not fair to just uh, rely on JP Morgan. So the Fed has three major policy tools. They control what's called the reserve requirement, the discount rate, and open market operations. So we're going to dive into each of these three, see how they impact the economy, and that's kind of what we're talking about today. So the Federal Open Market Committee consists of 12 members, the seven members of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, President of the Bank of New York, and the four remaining 11 Reserve Bank presidents who serve 1 year terms on a rotating basis. So we have like a Federal Reserve in St. Louis. They're a pretty famous one. If you've seen like any of the graphs, it's probably from a website that's called Fred, which is the Federal Reserve of St. Louis. I don't know how they arrived on Fred, but it's nice. Um, so let's see. Depending on the economic conditions, they decide whether to engage in contractionary or expansionary monetary policy. They can decide whether they want to increase, decrease, or keep the equilibrium money supply to get their target federal funds rates. So really what monetary policy is going to do is control what the equilibrium money supply is going to be. And by doing this, they can either grow the economy or shrink the economy. So contractionary would be shrink or expansionary could be grow. Okay, so these are the three major policy tools. We have the reserve requirement, which is a set overnight reserve requirements for banks. So we talked a little bit about this earlier. This is like if the Federal Reserve requirement is 10%, That means when I give $100 to the bank, they're required to keep $10 and they cannot hand out loans with those $10, but they can hand out loans with the $90. Federal funds market allow banks with excess reserves to loan out to other banks to satisfy overnight reserve requirements, of course, with certain interest rates. So that's one tool. Another tool is the discount rate. So this is the interest rate the Fed charges who takes loans. Discount rate, you've probably heard it in the news as the interest rate. Where maybe certain people in politics want this to decrease or increase. But the beautiful part about the Federal Reserve, at least right now, is it's completely independent of any politics. So they kind of just do what's best for the country and they don't really listen to the president or any other people in political power. And then open market operations. This is buying and selling assets in the open market, and they use this through treasury bills. So we'll see how this works, and this works. How each of these can be either expansionary or contractionary based upon the number they pick. So the federal funds market allows banks that fall short of the reserve requirement to borrow funds from banks with excess reserves, which allows them to meet their overnight reserve requirements. And then the federal funds rate is the interest rate determined in the federal funds market. So this is not under direct Fed control, but the Fed targets a specific rate for this. So the federal funds market is kind of just like helping out a buddy who's not at the reserve requirement, and a bank is going to help them out, but then they're going to want a little bit back. That's an interest rate. And that interest rate is determined by the federal funds rate. Okay, so the discount rate is for borrowing directly from the government. This is also, you can think of this as like the interest rate that the government is going to charge. Historically, it's a bad side for a bank to need the Fed's money. And the lower federal funds rate and discount rate can encourage more lending by banks. So if banks can borrow money from the government for very cheap, that means there's a low federal funds rate, there's a low discount rate. Then they're going to do that so they can lend out more money. So you can kind of see how this would be maybe expansionary policy if we have a real low federal funds rate. Um, so very nice. Open market operations, simply the Fed buying and selling assets in the open market, like any other trader you would find. So we have expansionary policy. This is when the Fed is going to buy US Treasury bills and they're going to pay them with cash. So this adds to the money supply because now the Fed is just simply going to inject more money into the system um, by buying these treasury bills. And contractionary would be selling these treasury bills. So the banks pay cash to the government. This takes money out of the money supply. So we have less money to go around. This is contractionary policy. So like when I first learned this, um, in like my intro class, the big thing that stuck was buying equals bigger. So if I'm the Fed and I buy treasury bills, that means I'm trying to grow the economy to make it bigger, so it's expansionary. So if that helps, great. Um, so why is it different from the Fed when the Fed buys an asset instead of a regular trader? Well, the person you buy from gets new cash in their account, and then you have this money multiplier effect, which we've talked about, but your account has less money. So the money multiplier effect is in the opposite direction, which forces it to cancel. But when the Fed buys, they pay with brand new money that didn't exist before. Um, but they don't actually just go to a bank and say, here's $100,000 on this pallet or in this briefcase. They all do it electronically. But essentially they create money. So when the government is buying treasury bills, they are quite saying literally saying, look, we are going to give you this money for this treasury bill that we gave you a long time ago. Um, and where that money comes from is just we are literally going to print it. Okay. So open market operations are the principal tool of monetary policy. Fed can increase or reduce the monetary base by buying government debt from banks or selling government debt to banks. So here's the Federal Reserve's assets and liabilities chart. Their assets are the government debt, which is this treasury bills. And then their liabilities are the monetary base, which is the currency in circulation plus the bank reserves. Okay, so for this example, let's look at an open market purchase of 100 million. So what happens is the Federal Reserve is going to has these treasury bills which are worth 100 million, and then there's a monetary base worth 100 million, so their assets equals their liabilities. Everyone in accounting is very happy because these two things equal, so we are all good. For commercial banks, they're going to sell their treasury bills to the Federal Reserve, so they're losing $100 million, but now they get $100 million in reserves. So you can't go and lend out money with these treasury bills. But now that I actually just give you the money for the treasury bills, now you're fluid to lend out money. So even though I'm losing 100 million in treasury bills, when I gain 100 million in reserves, I can do a lot more with it. So this is kind of like where the money multiplier effect is going to catch in. I'm going to loan this out to some people. They're going to pay me back. Now they're going to have money, so on and so forth. Um, Alternatively, if we have a sale of 100 million, then the Federal Reserve will lose treasury bills and liabilities in the same spot, so they're all happy. And then the commercial bank is just going to get treasury bills, but then they're going to lose money from the reserves. So when they lose money from the reserves, again, they cannot lend out as much, which means less lending means there's less money going in the system. So it's contractionary policy. Here's a little more detail about how money can be created. So, here it's kind of cut off. Wait, maybe I can fix this. Haha. Okay. So if I buy a bond, um, I'm going to buy a bond. So before I had $100 and I did not have any money in the bonds. My bank reserve is 10%, say, is like the federal funds rate. So I'm only allowed to buy a bond that is worth $90. The trader's account goes up, and then you see the trader's bank reserve goes up 100, and then the federal assets and liabilities are both 10. This is because of the federal fund rate. So now my bank must borrow to meet its reserve requirement, and the trader bank has $90 in excess reserves that it can lend out. So these will cancel out. But what's important here is when the government is going to buy, this means there's more money in the system for um, there's more money in the system for the banks to use. So if the Fed buys bonds, here you see it that um, the Fed has more assets and liabilities. In the end, they buy bonds. It's great. We still have this 10% reserve right here. My bank doesn't have to do anything. The trader bank has $90 in excess reserves to lend out, so the money supply is going to increase. Not a big fan of those tables, so I kind of went fast through them. So open market operations by the Federal Reserve. When the Fed buys assets, it increases the money supply. So pays with the new money, new loans increases M1. When the Fed sells asset, it's going to decrease the money supply, which again decreases M1. This takes in money, reduces lending because now I don't have a whole lot of money to lend out to people because I just bought, as a bank, I bought this asset from the Federal Reserve. But again, when we're talking about this and when we go like buy equals bigger, it is the government buying that equals the bigger. That's the expansionary part. So it's like um, government buying equals bigger. This is maybe a better way to think about it because it does get a bit confusing when we talk about, well, the bank is technically buying the asset that the government's selling, right? So But that would be contractionary policy. But then you say buying equals bigger, and then I say no, 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 no. It's whatever the government is doing. So if the government buys from the bank, meaning the bank sells to the government, then we get this action of expansionary monetary policy. Okay, so what assets does the Fed have? A lot. They're the largest holder of government debt, and they were first built up assets during World War II. And when they actually realized that they were creating money almost accidentally, they earn a lot of interest. So only profitable branch of government returns extra income to Congress after it spends as much as it wants. So it's another reason that it's autonomous, in that it's separate from politics, is that the we actually don't need to fund this as taxpayers. It actually makes money. Um, so this is fantastic because this means that when we pass like big spending bills, we never have to consider the Fed, because the Fed is just kind of fine doing what the Fed does, right? So the big important role of the Fed is how it responds to crisis. So when so we can buying these new assets was very important. No one else wanted to. The market value of these assets could have crashed, causing banks to have ceased lending or close or reducing the money supply. The Fed kind of bails us out in times of need. In 2008, the Fed had to step in. In the Great Depression, the Fed stepped in even during the like what's called Black it's not Black Friday. It's like Black October during before the Great Depression. There was a giant bank run and the Fed stepped in there. Um, so the Fed kind of helps out banks when things are really bad and no one that has a bank privately wants to like take on certain loans or give people money. The Fed can kind of step in and do that for us. So even with assets that aren't worthless, so like subprime mortgages, a crisis might require a lender of last resort. So they are the lender of last resort. If a company has illiquid assets but needs quick cash, they may lose too much money in a fire sale, so the Fed will lend on the basis of illiquid collateral, and it prevents otherwise valuable assets from crashing in value. So they kind of serve to, I think, a good way of looking at the Fed and monetary policy in general is they kind of stabilize the economy. Um, with fiscal policy, it gets very political. So fiscal policy might not actually do the correct actions at the correct time, but the Fed has a lot of control through monetary policy, through these uh, three tools that we're talking about to kind of stabilize where we are, which helps us a lot as a country. If we didn't have the Fed, we would be in trouble. Time after time, our crashes would have been way worse. Um, our high points probably would have been about the same, but the crashes would have been taking us a longer time to recover from, if we could recover from it. So we need to think about what money is for, and it's the opportunity cost of holding money. So if we have a short-term interest rate, these are the interest rates on financial assets that mature within 6 months or less. Long-term, we consider a number of years in the future. So what this kind of means here is if I take a short-term interest rate, this means that it's agreed upon that I am going to lend my money to you for 6 months, and after 6 months, you are going to pay me back with the interest rate. Okay. I cannot ask for it the next day back. I need to wait 6 months. If it's longer term, I'll say, talk to me in 10 years, and then you're going to pay me back a certain amount of interest. So the Fed also kind of they work with short and long-term interest rates. Actually, if you go online, they have like the interest rate on treasury bonds from like 6 month all the way to like 10-year bonds. And one of my buddies in the program, he's writing his dissertation on how these rates may be able to predict recessions. So interest rates. Treasury bills generally pay a slightly lower interest rate than other short-term assets in normal times. In the third week of October 2008, 1 month CDs were paying 4% interest, but 1 month treasury bills were paying only 0.26. What's the reason? Fear. So a sharp plunge in housing prices had led to a big loss at a number of financial institutions. This left investors nervous about the safety of many non-government assets. Generally, we do think that T-bills are the world's safest asset. So because they are so safe and we can rely on the US government, it's pretty fair that they should be charging a lower rate because there's a big demand for this asset. So on December 10th, 2008, in fact, 3 month treasury bills paid 0% interest for a brief period, which is ridiculously low, obviously. But yeah. Okay, so now we're kind of gonna, this first part was kind of just introducing what the Fed does, what are their tools. Now we're kind of gonna get into like our last model of the class, and it's about money demand and money supply. So the money demand curve shows the relationship between the quantity of money demanded and the interest rate. So, what is money for? Well, obviously, carrying out transactions, going to the grocery store and buying your groceries. It's a measuring value, and there's also a storing value. So there are other ways to store value. Many of those assets pay interest, but those aren't money. Okay. Um, this is what the money demand curve looks like. Okay. So as we have more money in our system, the interest rate is going to decrease, meaning when there's more money in the system, there yeah, the interest rate will decrease. When there is less money in the system, then the interest rate will be very high. Okay, so why is this the shape? Standard micro supply and demand. If my interest rates are high, you'd rather be holding some interest earning assets, which lowers the money demand. If the interest rates are low, holding money is cheaper, so we have higher money demand. Okay, so like this is important to realize with this. This is kind of like the demand for money for me to just have, right? So if the interest rate is really high, I don't really want to see my money because I'm going to put it in a savings account and it's going to make 20% interest and it's fantastic, right? So I'm going to have as little money as possible and keep all of it in that savings account because the interest rate is so high. But when the interest rate is really low, I don't really care that much about it, right? I'll keep more money in my checkings account. I'll be free to spend more. That's kind of like the intuition behind this money demand curve. So what shifts this? Well, if we have a change in the price level, real GDP, technology, or institutions. So if we have a fall in the money demand shifts, the money demand goes to the left, and if it's a rise, then it goes to the right. So it works the same as supply and demand does, essentially. So, like I said, we're developing a model for demand for money. You can probably guess what the next piece of this model is going to be. Um, let's see. So why do we want to do this? Well, we have transactions that depend on technology, institutions, store of value that pays no interest, other assets do. So if those assets pay a high interest, demand for money will be smaller. Okay, very nice. Here is the other piece. It's the money supply. So the money supply is going to be a vertical line. And most importantly, it is going to be chosen, picked by the Federal Reserve. Okay. So the Federal Reserve can increase or decrease the money supply by using tools like I have already introduced. I'll show you specifically how those work. And this, in turn, by picking the money supply along with the demand, is going to give us an equilibrium interest rate. Okay. So this is a typical exercise in monetary policy is the Fed is going to buy T-bills and they're going to pay with new money. This new money leads to new lending by the commercial banking system that shifts the money supply curve outward because remember, when we buy, it gets bigger. So by buying these T-bills, there's more money in the system, so the money supply shifts to the right. This is going to lower the equilibrium interest rate, and that's why we say that the Fed sets interest rates. Choosing money supply is the same as choosing R. So they don't, you do see this a lot where people will say, well, the Fed should lower the interest rate. They don't just announce right away, look, the interest rate has fallen. Well, technically, they kind of do, but they do it through this money supply way. So they are able to actually predict the money demand. And then along with that, they say, okay, yep, we're going to lower the interest rate. How they do that is they increase the money supply by maybe buying bonds, and then it lowers from R1 to R2. Okay, so suppose the money supply is at MS1, we're right here. If the Fed wants the interest rate to be RT, what should they do? So we have to decrease the money supply. There's a couple ways that we can do this. Let's see if they're going to get into it. Yes, okay, so we can push the interest rate up to target, pushing interest rate up to target rate requires open market sales. So instead of buying bonds equals bigger, this means selling bonds equals smaller. Okay. Um, Pushing the interest rate down requires open market purchases by the fund. So the target federal funds rate is Federal Reserve's desired federal funds rate. So they do target a certain rate, but then they use open market purchases to increase or decrease. Mainly what we've talked about is selling equals smaller and buying equals bigger, all through bonds. Okay. So this is why we act as though the Federal Reserve is under the federal funds rate is under the Fed's control. It's basically the shortest term interest rate there is. It's the interest rate the Fed can affect most easily. Um, so they decide on this every 5 to 8 weeks. They make like a nice announcement. There's big Jerome Powell that goes out there and he says, look, the economy, he usually starts by saying that what's the state of the economy? Oh, look, it looks like kind of bad or it looks okay. And then he says, okay, now we are going to target this federal funds interest rate. And then usually like the market kind of reacts accordingly. So the New York Fed executes trades constantly to keep the interest rate on target. The open market operations, let's see. So when they buy assets, it increases the money supply. When they sell, it decreases. Okay. So how does this work? So why, or I guess, why is this expansionary? I've kind of just assumed until this point that I say when we increase the money supply, it's expansionary. But here's a nice little graph which shows you how it gets from just increasing the money supply. So say we are buying bonds. We buy bonds. What does that do? It increases. So here's like there's money, there's the interest rate, here's your demand. Here's your money supply. We're buying bonds. So this shifts out. This lowers the interest rate, which means we have higher investment spending, which is going to raise income. Remember, because investment spending, if the interest rate is really low, this means that I can take out a loan at a low interest rate and then build my factory. Um, because of this, we're going to have higher consumer spending via the multiplier, which we've talked about. And then what this does is it shifts out aggregate demand. And this is how we get expansionary. So it's all demand side. By increasing the money supply, we effectively are going to shift out the aggregate demand. So in times of need, we are 100% going to do this. During the Great Recession, we actually did this so much by lowering the interest rate that the interest rate got down to 0%. And why we did this is because we really needed to get out of the Great Recession. Okay. Very nice. And then you do kind of see like what happens after that. There is a problem which I'm not sure if we're going to talk about, but it's kind of important, is we can't go lower than zero. So we increase the interest rate for two reasons. One is that maybe we need some contractionary policy. The economy is really hot, and we know that what happens is when the economy gets really hot, it tends to overheat, and then there's a big crash. So what the Fed can do is say, oh, it's getting hot. Let's kind of just stabilize this a bit. Okay, that's usually when they use contractionary policy in that way. Another reason why they're going to do this is quite simply because they want to be able to always do expansionary monetary policy. And if we're at 0%, we can't go negative percent. That doesn't work. I think it actually happened in Japan where they had like a negative interest rate once, which is crazy. But that's not a spot you want to be. There's a problem. It's called the zero lower bound. I can't go lower than zero, right? Okay, so let's continue. Expansionary, contractionary monetary policy. Remember, our whole story is about planned investment. So the planned investment depends on firms' decisions about investment opportunities. The lower the interest rate, the more projects are profitable. So this means that we have a higher planned investment. We have more people investing when the interest rate is low. Two different multipliers are in effect here. So we have a change in the monetary base from the open market operations. This is either paying with new money or taking money in and out of circulation. This leads to a multiplier effect on the bank balance sheet as lending either expands or contracts, which lowers the interest rate, and this increases plans investment. Once we increase planned investment, now we are in a different multiplier, which is surrounding consumption. So yeah. Okay. Um, Here again, we have like this planned aggregate spending and real GDP. So again, with expansionary, all we're doing is we're increasing aggregate expenditures, and contractionary policy is going to decrease aggregate expenditures. So it's consistent with all the models that we've talked about so far. This is just kind of like another piece, another way certain things can shift. Monetary policy and the multiplier. So let's see, what do we have here? We have aggregate demand is increasing due to a fall in the interest rate. Um, and how much it does increase is given by the multiplier times the change in investment. Okay, remember, whenever you see a delta, this equals change. If you keep taking econ classes, this is important to know because we always just do delta whatever variable. Delta always means the change in whatever. Okay. Expansionary monetary policy to fight a recessionary gap. This is usually when the Fed will step in with expansionary monetary policy. They're usually pretty reluctant to do it otherwise, but during times of need, like 2008, this is exactly when they do it. So when we have expansionary monetary policy, by reducing the interest rate and increasing aggregate demand, this can get us from a recessionary period, which is right here, back to like our long run equilibrium. And alternatively, when things are really hot, what could tend to happen is if the Fed doesn't do anything, this aggregate demand's really high right now. Maybe it could go a little bit higher and then it's really going to crash. Okay. This is just empirically what happens in our model. Obviously, that's not going to hold, but these models are not perfect. But what the Fed can do here is they can actually just have contractionary monetary policy, which is going to lead us back to the long run. So monetary policy, it's fantastic. It really helps us out a lot. Okay. Here's another little graph of what's happening. Here we have a double shift, which is crazy. So we have an increase in the money supply, which is going to lower the interest rate in the short run. So we go from E1 to E2. But in the long run, higher prices lead to greater money demand, which raises the interest rate to its original level back to E3. Okay. So all that is changed in the long run is instead of being M1, we have M2. And on the bottom, there's a nice little explanation about why all this stuff happens. Okay, two more exercises for the rest of the class. The next class, I will be talking about the Great Recession in 2008. It's going to be a great short lecture. That will probably be up by this weekend. So, if you're studying and you need a little extra motivation to study, maybe watch that lecture. If not, that's okay. I'm not going to really get offended. Let's get through these two exercises. So suppose the market for reserves is in equilibrium at a federal funds rate of 5%. Okay. It says depict this situation graphically. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put an interest rate. Here's our money. There's the demand. Here's our money supply. This is supposed to be a 5, and boom. Suppose the Federal Reserve then decides to start paying 1% interest on the reserves banks keep. Graph this effect this will have on the equilibrium funds rate. Okay, this is a bit of a harder question, which is why I kept it in here. Again, with all these questions, it's very important you explain yourself. When you explain yourself, you can develop a new angle to the problem that we didn't even see when we were writing it, which can help you get full points, and at the very least, it will help you get partial credit for the questions. So let's see what's happening. We have the Federal Reserve is going to pay 1% interest on the reserves the banks keep. So if I am a bank and say I have the Federal Reserve rate is 10%, and now we have and say I have $100, so I have $10. Okay. If the Federal Reserve is going to start paying 1% interest on those reserves, that means tomorrow I have $10.01. I believe that's right. Maybe $10.10. Either way, my money is going to grow. The reserves are going to grow just through this action by the Federal Reserve. So what happens then is rationally, I'm going to keep my money in there as a bank because now it's more profitable for me to have these my money in the reserves because we have a 1% interest. Okay. So I would argue that by doing this, this is going to make more people want to save, which is going to decrease the demand, the money demand. Okay. And then alternatively, I'm also going to say that the money supply is going to decrease too. Okay. So what's going on? And then we'll maybe end up right here where the money supply is lower. Okay. Actually, I'm going to change that. I'm going to make the money supply increase. So the money supply is going to increase because now I get 1% interest on my reserves. So organically over time, I'm going to have more money, right? And actually, I don't even need this money demand shifted. I think this is all that's happening here. There's no need to make it complicated. So by doing this, we have these reserves. These reserves are going to get 1%. So say throughout a year, my reserves increase by 1%. If I'm a big bank, that could be $1 billion. And now I have my reserve, my original reserve, which is still set, and I have an extra $1 billion. This increases the money supply because now I can use those extra $1 billion to give to out in loans, right? And as long as I charge a rate that's higher than 1%, I can make money on that. So all this is going to do here is just it's going to increase the money supply. This is going to lower the federal funds rate and increase so money supply increases and then the interest rate is going to decrease. Very nice. Suppose now the last one, we are at aggregate demand AD1. We are right here. What open market operations is appropriate counter-cyclical operations in this case? I think we've talked about this one quite a bit. I'll say it one more time. When the government, or the Fed specifically, when they buy, this equals bigger. So the answer here is going to be buying bonds or T-bills from banks. What this is going to do is going to increase the money supply, and effectively this is going to increase aggregate demand as that flow chart is as the flow chart suggests. Okay, well that is all I have for you guys. So that is the last lecture that will be material for your final. There will be one more lecture. It will be about the Great Recession. It's going to be super quick. I'll probably try to keep it under like 20 minutes. Um, so yeah, good luck studying for your final. If you have questions, come to my office hours, talk to me. Um, Thank you guys.